Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill him! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
Eros, I'm so excited to have you on the pod finally. One of my most favorite content creators of all. Obviously,
wow.
I mean, you're just an incredible intellect, and I think that you have a range and a depth of the material that you cover, which is so unlike like what I know about, that I can't help but be impressed. And I know that everyone else is kind of impressed by you too, and so I'm not trying to give you a big ego, but I think you are pretty great. So thank you so much for coming on, as well as being my friend and member of the Grey Lodge. And I just, yeah, I'm really excited. And we had planned to talk about anime, but you cleverly redirected us into discussing Jung's Red Book, which is, I think, is actually the correct and appropriate subject for us to actually sit down and discuss. So thank you, Eros, and please introduce yourself and plug your YouTube and all your socials and anything, any projects that you want to plug, and describe yourself in any ways that you would like to.
Sure, yeah, I'm so happy to be here too. I mean, those are some big compliments and I appreciate it, but I feel still like there's still so much that I have to learn and study, and I'm very much one of those people where I'm like, if I don't know every detail of something, I feel like I can't even act like I know anything about it, you know? Because sometimes those small details can change everything. Um, but yeah, I'm excited to talk about the Red Book because I feel like um, it's very like Age of Aquarius, very Aeon of the Daughter, as you would say. And I just love this book. And I know that you've read it too, but I just think that we're going to be able to talk about a lot with this one. I have a YouTube channel, ErosUp on YouTube. I'm not really anywhere else, no Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anything. And then I'm also on X at Eros to Ethos. And yeah, thanks for having me on, Jin.
Of course, the show's kind of open in the sense that I like people from my broader circle, or like people who are like that I orbit around. I like them to come on the show the most, like people like you, Solar, Cassandra, whomever, like those kind of people. That's who I really like to be on the show. That's the episodes that make me the most proud, to be honest. So thank you.
Yeah, I feel similarly when I'm interviewing people because it's just nice when there's a lot of commonality there and you know how to discourse with them. It just makes things flow a lot easier, I think.
I also should shout out that you did an amazing interview with Solar, who's a co-host on the show, as well as with me. And I really do love my interview, but I have to say that the one that you did with Solar kind of blew mine out of the water. But that's okay. I'll accept it.
Well, I mean, the interview with you was awesome because it's like getting, I mean, if anybody is interested in like tantric Buddhism, that was an excellent episode. I learned so much. It was like it was a lot for
It
sure.
was dense.
It
Yeah.
was super super dense. And then the one with solar was awesome. Uh, we went so long on that one, but even with Josh, that episode
Oh,
was
right,
really
right.
well.
Shit. I'm so sorry. Okay, I totally forgot. You also did an excellent episode with Josh. I totally forgot. I'm so sorry. Joshua, if you are listening, I apologize. And yeah, of course, Eros, you did an amazing interview with Josh as well, who is also a co-host on the show. I feel really bad now. But anyways, it is what it is. I'll leave it in. My mistake. Yeah, absolutely. I love that you did the three boys of the Grey Lodge, and then obviously you're kind of our you're like the fourth right now, which I love because it's like a totally different energy, and hopefully, as we continue forward, it'll be really, I think we'll have a great group dynamic. We're just like kind of on our new legs with the YouTube lives and all of that, but we'll see how it goes, and I think it'll be good. I'm positive.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the Grey Lodge is always adapting and changing, like everything else in the world.
Well, as you said, Eros, it is like an aeon in flux. So that's really the only way to, I would say, like, that's the only way to kind of move through the cycle, is you have to always be adaptable, flexible, and like willing to be self-reflexive and look at yourself. And I try and do that just like personally because of my tantric Buddhist practices, because that really forces you to look into a mirror in a very fundamental way. But I'm not perfect, and obviously socials can bring out the baddie Jin that I've kind of retired a little bit, but sometimes he comes out to play a little. So
Yeah, I feel like especially now, like things are kind of in a, I think, heightened period of chaos. But part of that is kind of great because it's almost like anything could spin into something, take form. Um, like in a sense, in heightened periods of chaos, maybe we have more power even.
I'm surprised to hear you say this, but also kind of edified. Well, I am edified. I'm not going to say kind of. I am edified to hear you say this. Not because I think I've been an influence on this thinking. I don't. And I'd never self-aggrandize like that. But I know that you and I have dialogued about this several times on air, on lives, and you were more, you were never anti-chaos, but you've always been very much pro-order. So I'm not saying your position necessarily has shifted, but I feel like perhaps you've allowed the chaos to be more in alignment, as you to use your language.
Well, you know, when it comes to the chaos of the world, it's not like we can really control these cycles. Um, and it's inevitable, though, like I have this theory that I really feel like they're pushing off like a major collapse. Um, but you know, I would still say, like, I would still probably encourage people to order themselves. Like, I don't know if I'm a huge fan of people who are very chaotic and unstructured and fragmented, but so I don't know. There's definitely times where I think we have to be maybe chaotic internally, but I feel like it should be more like controlled demolition, but that's just my opinion.
No, I agree with you, Eros. I think that is where, I mean, for me, I'll just say for me, rather than give a prescriptive approach for everybody listening. I always feel chaotic internally. So that's why I practice Buddhism, and that's why I practice Tantra, so I can deal with those things and tame my own mind. And so I can give myself sort of like form and structure to something that is what I would call primordially true. So I try not to be fragmented in my person outwardly. I just try and own those both negative and positive qualities, which aren't necessarily, I'm not saying negative as in um, bad inherently, but they can be negative as in the polarity. So I just try and not accept them as like fixed things. I don't believe they are fixed, but I try and accept them as they are. And then if I want to rectify them, I'll do that in sadhana rather than, uh, I am very much like myself in many ways. Like maybe I didn't start off podcasting as um, confident. I wouldn't say I'm confident now, but I still get very nervous many times, and especially doing lives. But on my own show, it's a little different now. But I have grown a lot. So I'm in a transitional period myself in that way, where I'm kind of rediscovering who I am and then also um, acknowledging like my podcast identity, quote unquote, who that is. And maybe even seeing myself in perception for the first time through podcasting, like hearing myself in editing or listening back to episodes like the episode I did with you. I listened to that probably 10 times, and it was so instructive because I could hear like my all the flaws that I would pick out maybe a year or 2 years ago. I'm okay with having, it's not that I like having mistakes. Obviously, I get very autistic about Kabbalah. I get very autistic about Tantra and Buddhism and how I like to articulate it. But I also know that I have to let those things go because I can't. It's alive. You kind of have to give up to the chaos a little. You have to kind of acquiesce that the things that come out of your mouth are kind of immutable at that point. So um, no, I agree with you, and I think that you have the best approach. I would say, the one of the strongest approaches to this archetypal astrology that you talk about and discuss on your channel, and you also look at all of these things in a very hermeneutic way. Like everything is a hermeneutic that you can, um, reorder yourself, reconstitute like the fragmented components. And I am borrowing your language by saying that. So
It's
I want to
probably
credit.
like some new age language that people would hear and be like, what is this? But it's the best language that I have.
I'm not. I would never criticize you for that because I would just call them aggregates. But to say fragments is not incorrect. Like that is also one way to understand the same thing as I would as that's how I understand it anyway. Is that I think that both of those are the same thing rather than, it's not really distinct things we're talking about. Maybe the minutiae are um, the translation or the commentary is a little different, but I've come around to accepting different ways of saying, different ways of speaking, and different ways of understanding the language used to describe very similar things.
Yeah. It's kind of cool too how sometimes there's a lot of parallels between like the Hermetics and Hellenists and the Buddhists, and that's always fun to find. But you mentioned like just having to edit yourself and stuff, and um what an ordeal that is. I mean, sometimes after I'm like watching myself and like editing myself, I feel like so toasted and fried after. Like it just really puts you in a weird perspective. But when it comes to the kind of inner chaos, I don't think that's abnormal per se. I hate feeling chaotic, honestly, but I think that there's always some of that. I mean, hopefully, unless you're like in a weird, like Neptunian fog and you're lost, or like maybe you spiraled out. Well, I mean, if you spiraled out very far, I would think that you felt quite chaotic too, or if you're too ordered and too stagnant somehow. But I think the self is always unfolding to us. And then we have to, and like, I feel like every time it could throw you off a little bit, or in that process of, being mirrored a new thing that you have to make sense of. That is kind of a chaotic process, and you just kind of sort it. You find like a meaning for it, and you find a place for it inside of yourself. And I did want to say one other thing about the fragmentation. Um, One thing I'm like very autistic about, maybe, or particular about, is the word fragmentation. Like, I use that very specifically because that's just how I kind of see, um, like, the universal, uh, like, differentiation uh, process to occur, you know, and I see a lot of the time people will call that entropy, and I think that both exist, but both are very different. And sometimes it kind of bugs me if somebody if calls something entropy, when really I feel like it should be called fragmentation.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that greatly. And I have perhaps become less inclined to my own specificity or my own inclination to articulate things in such a like Buddhistic or tantric framework, simply because I have found that a lot of people don't necessarily know the context from which I'm speaking. So I've probably gone a little more into that Neptunian, what I would call Hokmah, like like the wisdom space, where you kind of utilize the words as they appear, rather than the Bina or Saturnian elements, where you're pre-selective, like you're very, you're realizing that there's consequence to saying like what words you choose. So you're drawing specifically from the text. So I do appreciate that greatly. I just have to say that for me, I had to move away from that a little. Maybe that is a part of that process of defragmentization. Defragmentization. I can't even speak. I'm sorry. But it's de-aggregation. I'll use my language. So I think that is part of it too, is that I had to learn to be more flexible, just simply because there wasn't enough people who shared the same language as me, and the same understanding of even the understanding of that language. Even speaking to other Buddhists or tantric Buddhists, it can be so different how other people engage and um, have learned the words. So for me, I just had to go away from that. But I greatly appreciate that you bring specificity to your own work and to your own, to your own dialogues, that wherever you are, like if you're on a round table, or if you're on here, or you're on Grey Lodge, or whatever it is, like I appreciate that greatly about you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, but it makes sense, right? Because, um, I mean, I can't even think of some of the words you might use. I would sound so ignorant if I did, but like Bina, or gosh, you used a word the other day that I actually found myself Googling. Like mudra,
Oh, Mudra.
mudra, and then I was like, oh, that's Naruto,
But see, you got it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you didn't know, because you still understood conceptually what I was referring to. Like, you could imagine in your mind them doing the 9 animal seals. So it doesn't really matter if you understood directly what I was referring to. You could draw from your own context, from the aether. You were able to come up with something that already existed in popular culture, that was already concretized. So as long as you had the image in your mind, I mean, I know you don't necessarily consider yourself like a quote unquote magician or sorcerer or a witch. I would never say that. But in a way you are. In a way, a lot of the people in the lodge, they would say they're magic adjacent, but I would say that because we're all engaged in this kind of process of consciousness, processes of wisdom science, that's why I also relate things to Kabbalah. Like when you're talking about Neptune, I'll say Hokmah, but I'm really referring to a similar thing, not exactly the same thing, but because I actually want people to learn when they're listening to the show. Maybe they don't agree with my attribution of Bina, or not Bina, Hokmah to Neptune. Maybe they don't agree. No, it's totally okay. But I also think it's interesting for them to question it, to learn, and to be like, maybe there is something interesting here. Maybe there is an attribution that Jin's talking about that is real. And so maybe it forces them into a more conceptualized and also specific way of thinking of the tree. So that's the only reason that I do Kabbalah drops, is really I do it for the audience. I don't really do it for myself anymore. But when I started, I definitely was very much aligned with the tree. Like I would sit on rejects roundtables and sort of work through the Sephira. And then I would talk about it like on air. And it was so cool in a way. And but then, not everybody understands that language. So I've kind of been more chill. I've kind of I'm in my unk phase. I don't know what to say. But anyway.
Yeah. I mean, the terms that we use for ideas, to a certain extent, it's, does it really matter as long as we can communicate the underlying ideas properly? No, but I think at the same time, it is nice to have common language because it can save a lot of explanation. So, and what even is language?
Well, I take the Wittgensteinian approach. I know this is contentious among other people, but I think we should just burn the words, let them go into space, then we can re-aggregate, re-concretize them into material reality as we will it. Rather than, we have so many words, like we are so fortunate in English. I hear a lot of people in like the quote unquote occult world discuss these ideas of, oh, English is like this broken language, or you'll hear like leftists say it's like a colonialist language. And the reality is it's a very syncretic, synthetic, and I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, but it is very synthetic, has a lot of borrowings, and that's not bad. And it's also very adaptable, as we were talking about. Like you have to be adaptable. Well, English is very adaptable. English syntax is very different than syntax in other languages because it is so flexible. You can really play with it in a way that other languages can. And I say this as someone who does actually speak other languages. I'm not just, a monolingualist, monolingual, saying it like speaking out of my ass. I'm saying, no, there's something here. I don't exactly know. I'm not a PhD in linguistics, but I think that there's something. English has incredible potential. I don't necessarily know if we've mastered it. I'm not saying for you, Eros, but maybe especially for me, but I think broadly, I think we haven't quite tapped what it can do. So
Yeah, I only speak English, so I can't speak on it, but I think language in general is kind of rough. I talked about this with Josh in the interview that I did with him. But I just watched this lecture from Terence McKenna a while ago, and he was talking about how he felt like we needed a new language. Because language is all just us trying to uh, describe things or describe feelings or whatever. It would be nice if we had a better language, maybe that wasn't just purely words, but maybe there was a visual component of it, or as well, like, or just some way to be forced to express truth, because you can lie so much through language. And if you just look at how like animals communicate and stuff, there's a lot of body language or a changing of colors or whatever. But obviously that was kind of, he's a big DMT person. He, I think, had this belief that there is a language in which we could literally speak things into existence, and like create 3D truth right in front of everyone, which would be the purest communication if we could. I guess that's far-fetched, but
I
I
don't
don't
think so.
know. It's possible. I don't know. If we study metaphysics enough and language enough, and maybe.
I definitely think that is possible, and I'm not a big Terence McKenna person, but I mean, in Tantric Buddhism, they teach you like this is how to get there. Like if there is a there, that's exactly what it is. It's sort of burning the all the conceptual words or the conceptual language, and you're allowing like the primordial word to arise. And the primordial word doesn't necessarily have qualities, but it can. And it can contain the truth in the most pristine way. So I agree that there's something that he's saying that is very interesting metaphysically, and I also agree with you that if we do study metaphysics enough, and I know, like, to bring up chaos magic, this is very much an idea of chaos magic. Like, it's not just creation of a sigil with your own will. It is actually the recognition of the sigils that already exist, maybe that are older than the words itself. So I definitely think you're not off, and you're not far off in Neptune. You are much closer to home, maybe at Mercury or Venus, or maybe even the sun or the moon. So I agree with you. Okay, now we're going to get deep, deep, deep into Red Book, which is, I think, a really interesting topic. And I think Eros was definitely the right one to discuss it with, because she's vastly more knowledgeable than me, although she did credit me for having some knowledge of it, which I hope I can keep a pace with her. And, but I'll do my best. I'll give it a true sorcerer's go. So, Eros, the Red Book, what are your
Yeah.
initial thoughts on it?
Well, we were just speaking about language, and a big part of maybe the Red Book that he emphasizes is that, we aren't our thoughts, right? We're not our intellection or our language. Obviously, a lot of intellection we do is speaking to ourselves in our head. At least I think, right?
No,
You
this is correct. This is totally
okay?
right.
Um, sometimes you say something and then you're like, wait, maybe not everybody, but obviously there's also like symbol and stuff like that too. But you could even say like symbol and diagrams, and all of that is also in a sense uh, language of sorts. Um, but it's really about finding the soul, um, and about taking ownership of the soul and the self. becoming a god, really. I mean, which sounds insane, but you know what I mean. Just self-authored, but also that idea of, he certainly gives commentary in the Red Book about Nietzsche's idea of God being dead, right? Like that we killed the gods with science. Um, and, he did believe that men are the next gods, right? As in, like, humanity. Um, and I think that for that reason, and just how much he emphasizes individuation and taking control of your own fate, it is very much a book for the age of Aquarius.
I totally agree 100% with everything that you said. I think the point about language, symbol, and diagram is really interesting because he clearly is obviously drawing from a lot from subconscious language of symbols. And even in his own, even in the Red Book itself, it utilizes, if you like, obviously I'm going to read things through a Kabbalistic lens. And I think that he also was perhaps deeply influenced by that same framework. But people will find that contentious, which is fine. But I specifically recall the story of him being, I think it was in Austria, where he sees a mounted figure on a horse. And then he goes on to describe this scene, and then he mixes it with this idea of a dream. So he's kind of blending, it's very parafictional, like he's mixing reality with this kind of liminality and making it, a metaphor for his sort of ideas of the world.
Oh yeah, I mean, the Red Book, just in general, right, he keeps going into these scenes where he's interacting with these, um I don't know what you would call them, but they're really like these, they represent an archetype in his own psyche, right? So he called this active imagination. So this was all stuff that he kind of set up himself to do, like, and so he was still doing psychiatry at the time and living a fairly normal life, but he was doing these exercises where he would kind of create like a scene for himself and kind of decide who he wanted the archetype to be that he wanted to confront or get closer to. And he called the process active imagination. So he would just, I don't know if I would be able to, or even if I would want to, because I think that it's a dangerous thing to probably do unless you're really confident about it. Um, you know, going into these active imagination, like dream states where you're almost mixing reality and dream too much, where I feel like that could be confusing and dangerous. But he was able to do this, and he would just set out, a couple hours or whatever to do the little exercise. And then, even in one of them, which is one of my favorite stories in the Red Book, the Anchorite, there's a couple chapters dedicated to the Anchorite, but the Anchorite gets angry at him towards the end. And as the Anchorite is like going to attack him, he just kind of like wakes up from it. So he had really good control over this process, and it's really fascinating. Um like quite an interesting magical experiment for individuation, honestly. Um, but also kind of insane.
Well, it did kind of make him insane while he was writing the Red Book, at least from the histories that people have recounted of it. So I think you're right, and you're saying that it's dangerous. But I want to say, maybe in the most succinct way that I possibly can, what I think is what you described is he is actually doing magic. That's what it is. That's what I mean. I could even describe it to Eros using astrology, like Yetziratic astrology. So we're starting off in Mercury or Hode. He's going to Hesed, which is so Mercury or Hode is obviously the analogical thinking, the sort of like the words, the names, the language he's going to use. So that's figured out. Then he goes to Jupiter Hesed, which is really just perception. It's just perception of the event, but fully perceptive. Like you're looking at, maybe you could say, both sides. Then you go to Binah, which is Saturn. And so you're putting things into concretization, your will, that's one way to describe it. And then you're going to Neptune or Hokmah. So you're going to that place of the imaginal. But because you're saying it's active imagination, you're drawing from the blue pillar, Hokmah, and you're bringing it back into Binah, the red pillar, because you have to bring it back into material reality in order to write it down, because that's really what text is. So I would say that this is just a magical process. This is like a magician's, it's not a guide. It's the underlying principles of magic. He's talking about doing it. But if you're not looking at it in that layer, perhaps you would miss it. If you're looking at it, I'm not saying you, Eros, because you don't look at it like that, which is that's why we're friends, is because you're cool like that. But I think a lot of people look for maybe just simply the psychological. And I think that that's missing a layer, a big part of the layer.
Well, he does talk about magic in the Red Book too. There's a certain point in it where he is speaking of like horror creeping over him, and he's like, am I not tightly bound? Is the world not unlimited? And he's kind of just in horror at maybe feeling like the world is like more open and full of potential and uncertainty than maybe he had thought before, because it's also he started out Catholic, I believe, and throughout the book, he talks about Christ a lot, especially in the beginning. He's like, there's some digs at pagan, like, oh, you sound like a pagan. And then at a certain point, right, with the anchorite, he is kind of like worshiping nature. He is like looking at these beetles and he's like worshiping them. He's worshiping the stones and the sand. He sees Helios come down on his chariot in the morning and cast down like this pile of like snakes, and they're like going back into the ground as he's coming down from the sky. And he believed that, and this is another reason why I say it's just an Age of Aquarius book, is because he believed that you become like Christ, but then we're supposed to kind of go even beyond that. And he definitely took Christ as the know thyself Christ, right? So he uses it as like example for individuation, where maybe Christ is the Piscean archetype. He doesn't necessarily believe in um, becoming the Piscean archetype. You know, he believes in becoming your own archetype. And at a certain point, he says, I will become like Christ, like I'm going to become like Christ, which means that I'm no longer Christian. And so he has quite a, I would say, religious journey. And I guess I'm forgetting now why I even brought that up. But in all of his horror, you know, his soul whispers to him that in all the uncertainty, like, comes the gift of magic. You know, that's where you kind of take up the reins, right? Once you're um past all of these things, right? Because at this point he's past the killing of the hero and the um he's like birthed his god at this point, you know, the Orphic egg kind of analogy where his god births out of the egg. He is past this crisis of meaninglessness, um, just a lot of things. Um, and once you're past all of that, and it's just like everything is so wild and untamed, and it's almost like you get to that point where it's like, yeah, it's time for full authorship. It's time for magic, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
That was beautifully said, Eros. So thank you for articulating it like that. I'm going to do a little Kabbalah because I think that you actually laid out the framework for exactly what I'm going to say. I'm just going to translate it into my way. So the death of the hero can actually come at two places. So it can be at Tiferet, which is where Christ would arise if you're using Christian Kabbalah like Pico on the tree. So the sun, so you were saying like Helios, like you could even consider like Helios and Christ analogous. It might not be the same density of the Sephira, but they're at the same location, we could say. But there's another death of the hero, which also happens at Neptune or Hokmah. And this is also in Tantra. Not that I'm going to derail us with that, but there is a story in Tantra about how a goddess vomits a black egg. So I found that very interesting. And I would place her at Neptune as well, or at Hokmah. So there's an idea that you travel from this Neptunian smoky ground full of horrors. I think that was the word that you brought up that made me really think of Hokmah. It's the smoky carnal ground, smoky palace of the mind. It's full of ghosts. So then what you do, well, in one form of Kabbalah is that you go back down to Gevra. Now, people who are familiar with the Hermetic tree will say there's no path between Hokmah and Gevra or Neptune and Mars. But in Lurianic Kabbalah, there actually is. It's actually considered to be a very important path. So the smoke can travel upwards from Gevra because Gevra is Mars, martial. So it's fire. Like you can say that as an essential quality. So it's the sort of destruction of matter. So the smoke has to go somewhere because we're obviously talking about alchemical terms as well, layered in there. But you can also say that the flux or the metallic particulates of matter have to travel in order to individuate into their sort of material components. So that you were saying like he suggests that you become a god or you become your own god, but there's also like a Christian element of this, which is very much in line with Pico. But then there's also this adamantization process, this in kind of quote unquote, we'll call it Enochian, but it's not really. This Adam Kadmon appears in all, wisdom literature from especially like the Christian, the Jewish, but even in like Tantric Buddhism, we have a lot of ideas of like the adamantine hero. But the adamantine hero is really you, but you're not him or her yet. You have to go through these stages of consciousness. So the metal particulates travel back down from Hokmah into Gevra, and at Gevra, they're able to form, maybe we could say, weapons. Where does the sword go? Well, as you and I have discussed, Mars and Venus have this really interesting relationship where Mars loves to pour his heat or his sword into Venus because she's a diamond. She's so resplendent, so beautiful. He can't help but want to poke her, no pun, with his sword. So the sword would then travel down to Netzach or Venus. So then where does that leave us? Well, very interestingly, the path of redemption, of rectification, would then begin at Netzach. It would begin at path 17, which is the path of the saint, interestingly enough. And so that is from Netzach to Yesod. So Yesod is the foundation for which we can cross the abyss or cross the tree again. So I actually think that what he's talking about and what you're talking about, Eros, is he's talking about going up to Keter or going up to Dath, maybe, and experiencing the whole tree, then returning back down, Sephirotic experiences, Merkaba journey, and then he has to go up again. And how do you go up again? Well, once you've traveled the tree in the zigzag position, like the code of the lightning flash, you actually should go up again in the middle pillar. That's kind of the idea, is that once you've experienced what the supernal triad has to offer, you come back down with that wisdom or that knowledge or both, and you kind of have to make something of it. So from Yesod, you can travel into Tiferet, which would be Christ consciousness, but you actually want to go past that all the way either to Dath or Keter, depending on how you formulate the tree. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm sorry to, take us on a tangent, but I think that it's actually the same. You and I have been talking a lot about language and like this kind of like how to speak to certain people or how to speak about certain things and what framework to use to sort of conceptualize it. Well, I think that's a really good one for modern, for a young modern magi who's like appraising magic right now is using Kabbalah. But that's just one idea, right? Like you could use your system the way that you even just perfectly articulated it just now. And I think that it's saying the same thing. And maybe that will be more relevant to people who have more of that worldview.
Yeah, I think everything that you're saying makes a lot of sense. Um, and especially the Mars part and the middle pillar, absolutely. Because, when he talks about the birthing of a god and like the inner god, it can be hard to distinguish that from his idea of the like psychic libido, right? Um, and I think that there is, I mean, more than anything, when navigating the soul, um, it's a very energetic thing. It is like a very libido thing, not just as in like sexual energy, but just energy in general, right? Like, um, just how things flow, how your energy interacts with the world. Like, there's a sense that you have to get to know that, get comfortable with that. And I think that's perhaps where some of that Mars comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, which I think is like very misunderstood. But if we're talking about this kind of process, I mean, we might as well start at the beginning. Um, I could kind of walk us through the Red Book and maybe we'll find some parallels.
Sure. Let's do that. I want to say one thing really quick
Yeah.
about your previous point. You said about the worshiping of nature. this made a lot of sense to me, like in a Buddhist way, is that you would go through this kind of period of non-dual realization where you would kind of, I was thinking in my head when you were relating it, is that he's having his Baruch Spinoza moment, his kind of like pan-entheist, kind of like all the world is, God is contained in all the world, which is true in a way. But I also like to say that God is non-phenomenological, whatever you conceptualize God to be. He or whatever it is doesn't really take shape in the material world. It takes shape in our perception. So but it does make sense to me. It totally makes sense to me why he would then, after he's come down from Keter, he's experienced a supernal love that is totally ineffable, that is not really relatable, describable, but it's also related to that libidinal energy that you're talking about, that martial energy, that martial Venus connection. Because that is what Yesod is. It's really like the moon. It's where all the energies of the world, of the three worlds, they have to be rectified. That's really what that position on the tree is for. Is to rectify all of that in your own mind. And then once that is rectified, the fire and the water together, understanding like how those can flow into each other, and they're not necessarily polarities of each other, but rather they're um, interdependent phenomena. Like they require each other to exist. So once you understand like how to sort of make the lightning from the upward rising lightning, anyway, you can, then you go into Tiferet, then you go into the sun or the solar energy. But at first, when you've come back down, you have to sort of reconcile all of those individual components, but you also see them in the world as being, I hesitate to use the word divine, but I think that he would be comfortable with that, and I hope you would be too. But anyways, I'm sorry, Eros. I didn't mean to derail us. I just thought Baruch Spinoza. So I can understand what she's saying.
Well, yeah, no, I think it's interesting that you said that too, because um I think probably everybody's journey is a little bit different, right? Like experiencing like the Christ consciousness, or like the um like that like agape, for example. I wouldn't say that Carl Jung ever experiences that in the Red Book. He is far too Saturnian. I mean, he meets his joy and he's like, ah, that's the devil. And he like hardly accepts his joy even then. But I think that's okay, because even the way that he starts the Red Book out, right? Like he's kind of like um I'll just read it to you real quick. I feel like you totally relate to this too. This is so you.
Okay, go for it, Eros.
All right. He says, "It is no teaching and no instruction that I give you. On what basis should I presume to teach you? I give you news of the way of this man, but not of your own way. My path is not your path, therefore I cannot teach you. The way is within us, but not in God's, nor in teachings, nor in laws. Within us is the way, the truth, and the life. Woe betide those who live by way of examples. Life is not with them. If you live according to an example, you thus live the life of that example. But who should live your own life if not yourself? So live yourselves. The signposts have fallen, unblazed trails lie before us. Do not be greedy to gobble up the fruits of foreign fields. You do not know that you yourselves are the fertile acre which bears everything that avails you? Yet who today knows this? Who knows the way to the eternally fruitful climes of the soul? You seek the way through mere appearances, you study books and give ear to all kinds of opinion. What good is all that? There is only one way, and that is your way. You seek the path, I warn you away from my own. It can also be the wrong way for you. May each go his own way." And, in reading the Red Book, there's certainly things where it's like I can tell that his journey is different from mine, you know. And then there's like places where it's like, wow, that's part of my journey. Like I wholeheartedly resonate with that.
I think that is the mark of a master magician. You don't like I'm not saying I'm a master magician. I'm definitely not. But I appreciate that you thought it would resonate with me, which it did, obviously, because it's something that I do speak about because people often ask me about Tantra and they're like, how do you know so much? I'm like, well, I just practice Tantra like every day. That's how I really learn. And that's really the main hermeneutic for me. But of course, I read a lot and I listen to a lot of Dharma talks and I listen to people who are smarter than me. And I read a lot of books on chaos magic and left hand path and all these different things. So um, I try and forge my own path. I think that's what I resonate with the most. But I agree that I am overly Saturnian towards myself, which is a very Saturnian quality where I treat myself as the greatest adversary. So I think that you kind of clocked me on that earlier today. Is that I am hard on myself by far the most. The my most I'm the most critical of myself by far, and I'm critical of other people, but I'm definitely the most critical of myself. So I think it's hard then to say, okay, Eros, you need to do what I do because if you think that you are I'm not saying that I think I'm like the most flawed human in the world, but I definitely my flaws are very acute to me at least. And so it's hard for me to then give you advice or to give anyone advice. Not that I'm a teacher, not that I would ever give anyone advice, like more than just a friendly suggestion if they asked, obviously. But that's why. It's because it's so difficult to be like, I'm so imperfect. Like, who am I in the world to look at myself and say, I'm like this example that you should then, you know, utilize as like a foundation of praxis. I find that very uncomfortable. It almost makes me want to vomit, to be honest, to even think about that. So I agree. But I think he's right. And I do agree that like not the Marga is not going to be the same for everybody. And I think that's what I like about your approach of doing this archetypal astrology. I think it sort of allows people to build the tree within their own charts and relate the archetypes that they would conceptually be useful for them. But I like the idea that you don't actually identify with the archetype. Just you utilize it as a tool, but then you can let it go. So I don't know if that responded in a way that was interesting for you, Eros, but I appreciate that you read it and that you thought of me.
Yeah, I mean, you could take or leave the archetype, I suppose. That is to each their own. I mean,
For the record, I like archetypes. I'm not saying that I would discard them, but I
yeah.
think that he is suggesting that it's not always useful for people to model themselves after the archetype. After, like, if you're saying, "Oh, I want to live a Christ-like life," or you want to be like me and you want to withdraw from certain worldly things, that is not going to be right for everybody. And I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think he's just saying kind of that everybody has their own journey, you know? Um like for example, I feel quite uncomfortable giving people advice like of what they should do in their lives and stuff like that because it's like the only thing I can encourage you is to like know yourself. Like maybe I could mirror something back to you. I could look at your astrology and um use that as a mirror to you. I somewhat and like that's where it's kind of weird for me too is I don't like telling people who they are, you know. Um it's it's too complicated. Everybody has different relationships with the archetypes and like different ways of perceiving. Um, everybody lives in almost their own universe, you know. They're seeing it from their own perspective, from their very unique viewpoint. So I somewhat feel uncomfortable telling people about themselves when I'm giving like astrology readings and stuff. I like really prefer to like help people work through things. If it's like, oh, you're having like a rough time in life right now, or like you're really struggling with this, or you're feeling a lot of confusion around that, let's try to like help you in that area and like help give some timelines of when clarity might arise or when the hardships might end, or like what kind of karmic lesson this might be suggesting. Um, but I feel extremely uncomfortable telling people who they are, or like um, giving them suggestions. I'll give some suggestions based off of like their lot of spirit or something like that, just because I think it's quite accurate and it's quite simple, and people could build their own story around it that is highly resonating for them, just to help them kind of find some meaning, right? If they're having a crisis of meaning or something, which most people are. But anyway, I'm really rambling on about that, but I think that's more so what he's getting at is like he can't tell you the right path for you or the right um process of individuation, right? Because even in this book, right, he starts out and he is, well, first of all, he is visited by the spirit of the abyss, right? And basically, the spirit of abyss gives him like this hallucination where he's just seeing as far as the eyes can see, um, like covered in I think 2 feet of like this yellow mucky water, and the spirit of the abyss is telling him that like this is going to be like all of Europe, like this huge event is going to happen, like so many people will die. um it was a preemptive vision of World War One, I suppose. I think
That sounds right. It could have
I
been either or, but I think that sounds right.
1918. I
Yeah, World War One.
So anyway, and then he goes into the desert, right? And this is a big one where he is sitting with himself and he's in the desert and he just feels really alone, and he's like, where is myself, right? He realizes when he's alone there in the desert that he's an empty shell. There's no richness in him to interact with. You know what I mean, where you just
Mhm.
feel really alone and empty, and he realizes that he has been chasing after like people and things for so long that he has never tended to himself. And so that's his first realization of like, wow, I'm like really empty when I'm alone and away from things, and I can't really sit here with myself, or it's painful. And that's his first step. Is he sits there in the painful abyss, right? In the heaviness, in the uncertainty, in the meaninglessness. Um, and he just sits there, and he believes that the meaning kind of comes out as a whisper over time, and that you do have to sit with the abyss for a while. And I would say that's a big portion of the book. I mean, most of the book is just him sitting in the abyss, him being dragged into hell over and over. And that is what it's like. But I wonder, is that a thing in the Kabbalah? Is that
Yes.
how it works? You are an empty shell and then you keep getting dragged into hell.
Well, I mean, yes, 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 and yes. So even the yellow waters, like when you're saying the murky or dirty yellow waters, so that's Asya, so that's like the lowest of the four worlds. So you're seeing things in the sort of decayed colors. That's what the colors are at that. Because I identify with Kabbalah through colors mostly. So if you're seeing that kind of, it's sometimes depicted as slime green or described as slime green, but it can also be described as like a sickly yellow.
Hmm.
So it's the same color. It's just like different people have different perceptions, right? So then the descriptions will slightly differ among people who've had the same experience. And also men tend to be slightly colorblind with certain colors like blue and purple, green and yellow. Those tend to blur for us a little more. Purple and blue also. So if I didn't say that, I maybe said that bad. I apologize. Green and blue, purple and blue, yellow and green. So those tend to be like interchangeable or conflated sometimes. So that's why I'm saying that about Asya. So that's when you're at the lowest level of your understanding of the world and the lowest level of your perception of yourself. But once you cross the abyss, so you're saying he spoke to the spirit of the abyss, this just speaks to me. This is like the classic magician's trope, is crossing the abyss. But there's actually an interesting sort of thing that you might, I don't know if you can tell me, Eros, if you think it's interesting or not, but something David Heim Smith talks a lot about is that there is no death. And this is sometimes considered to be very radical among Hermeticists because death is always positioned on the tree for the golden dawn. And they like their version of the tree the best, and that is what is spread mostly in popular culture. But in Lurianic Kabbalah, Dath is taken off the tree, not because Dath doesn't exist, but because it has to be created between Saturn and Neptune, between Binah and Hokmah. You have to create it. The magician has to create it. And when you cross the abyss into that desert, because that's exactly how Dath can appear sometimes, it's a dead place. It's a carnal ground. It's totally empty. There's nothing there. Sometimes you can even say death is there, but it's not conventional death. It's death as yourself. So you have to conquer that aspect of yourself. Like, what is left? What is left after, as you were saying, when you were in those complete moments of solitude, when you are a quote unquote desert father, or Mary of the desert, or one of the desert mothers, or any of them, any prophet or religious figure who goes through an oasis or a desert. And this is very common in Jewish wisdom literature. So who is left? And as you're saying, it's empty. Well, it doesn't have to be empty, but some people are. But there's also something else. There's the husk. Well, what is the husk? The husk is who we quote unquote pretend to be. So we must have a husk or a vessel. So I think that your language of like integration, bringing those decoherent components into the vessel, but not allowing those components to sort of blind us to what we really are. I think that is sort of what he's talking about, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, absolutely. E- Especially that we have to create our own meaning. That's really kind of that birth of the god, right? Um so he talks about this idea of merging like the intellect or like the spirit with the soul and birthing that God, which is really because, and he never says anything too clearly or too directly, not really, right? But he mentions in that whole ordeal, because this is when he is going through and he is talking about meaninglessness and how that's just the polarity, right? Like you have to be able to sit with meaninglessness and meaning in a sense. Um And sometimes you just have to sit with meaninglessness for a long time before your soul whispers to you. But he also does speak of us creating our own meaning, and that the birth of that God is really us creating meaning. He goes on so far as to say that um, humans are really the only ones that can create meaning, which is maybe, um, maybe some people would think is ballsy to say, but like, I mean, if you really think about it, it makes sense to me, at least. I don't know why that's always stood out as beautiful to me, but when you're also thinking of this idea of humans being maybe the next gods, right, of self-godhood being the next phase, which is very Age of Aquarius to me, that's what I think it's all about. That just
Yeah.
stands out to me
I
as,
just want to say that, yeah. Sorry, Eros, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to say
oh,
you're like, that's the Aeonic framework, is that I don't know if I would call them like self gods, but to the apotheosis of man, for sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no,
I got
yeah,
excited and was like, yeah, she's right. I love it. Aeonic framework.
right. I know, like a lot of the time when I hear you talking about the Aeon, right, like it resonates with me for that reason. But so we birth this God, right? And then he talks about us having to raise it from a child. Um, and so I like that too, almost like that first whisper of your soul, right? Like you create meaning with that, and then you have this little God baby in you, in this like um, born out of this psychic libido, and then you raise that little God baby from there, basically.
Well, it is really interesting also because in the Aeonic framework, because there is a child Aeon. Like I always have said there's 3 Aeons for every Aeon, or at least for this one. Maybe I won't speak for every Aeon since I don't have memory of those, but I live in this one. So for this Aeon, I posit there are 3 Aeons. Like one is a child, but it's pregenerative. So exactly what you're saying, you have to raise it up. And then there's the other 2, which are male and a female. So it is really interesting to me that it is kind of like a child, like the child god that you have to birth. And then like the Aeonic framework posits that there's also like a child deity. I don't know. There's something, yeah, it's like, it's definitely parallel currents, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think all the eternal truths are, you know, people are going to find the same truths, I think, in any framework. Um, but then this idea too of maybe like that false self, right? Jung certainly has to destroy that false self, which is really hard, and that goes into the death of the hero and all of those things, and almost accepting certain things like evil, where he's one of the first, I guess, scenes that he sets up for himself is meeting with Elijah and gosh, what is her name? Simone? She's like, according to like Gnostic belief, I don't think that this is canon in the Bible, but I'm not super versed in the Bible, but she is like Jesus's sister that cuts off, I think, one of the apostles' heads. Do you know
Okay,
what I'm
yes,
talking about?
Salome. Salome.
Yeah,
She
yeah,
cuts off
yeah.
John the Baptist's head. She is the daughter of King Herod.
Oh, well, in the red
It
book,
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's we can retcon it. We'll retcon
yeah,
the
yeah,
Bible.
yeah.
We'll be very metafictional.
So, he goes through that, but he definitely goes through that period of like killing that false image of himself. And I felt like I didn't really resonate with that because I'm one of those weird cases. Um, I have Saturn and Aries squaring my sun, and so I think that kind of caused me to grow up and not have an ego really, in a weird way where like I had like no sense of myself. So I didn't have like a false sense of myself. If you had asked me to describe myself, I wouldn't be able to. Like I didn't even really believe that people had any concrete things about them. I thought that people just kind of picked personality traits and that it was all fake. Um, and
I don't know if
largely
you
it
were wrong
probably
though.
is. Yeah,
Yeah.
largely it probably is, but at a certain point it was like, I had originally, at like, I don't know, 16, 17, I was like, oh, well, everybody just kind of picks things. So I'm going to find like people who I think are really cool and I'm just going to like imitate those people. And then, a couple years of doing that, I felt very empty. I was like, this just doesn't feel like me. This is fake. And then for a long time, I don't know, I didn't try to be anything. And I would say like I was quite empty. I was like, well, maybe I'm like a nice person, but like, am I even especially nice? Like, I really have no way to, um, describe myself. But then, over time, just kind of practicing dialectic, I was like, and also astrology, I was like, you know what? No, there are like some differences between people that are very distinct, and people have their strengths and their weaknesses. And I can look at people and see how they're different, um, and what things they're good at, what things they're bad at, just naturally. And that has to say something where, people are different and do kind of lean towards different personality traits or different whatever, right? And then that was really my start of building that up. So I think it's kind of a different um, start and a different journey, I guess, maybe, than like what Carl Jung had, for example. So that's just one of those examples of how it can be different for everybody.
Well, at least in a Buddhist way, and maybe this is why I am Buddhist, like to begin with, is because I believe strongly in like the potential for people to develop their own Buddha nature and sort of become saints in the world. And so, if they choose, right, and even in Kabbalah, like a saint or a zadi, there's actually an opposite figure called a Russia, which just means like an outlaw. For every zadi, for every saint, there is a Russia, an outlaw. Can be a villain, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And then there's this Rabbi Nachman, who talks about how the Zadi and the Russia are actually the same person, but they can sort of play, dance, and divide. But they always come together, and they can also switch positions. So I think that a lot of this is about who do we want to be, and how do we become what we want to be.
Well, I think it is true that we could be anything that we want, but there's gonna be, like, I also think that we have our innate nature, and that's gonna be the easiest version of ourselves to be, where we're met with less roadblocks and it just flows like really nicely. And even if you were to get to like to where like you really know yourself and you're mirrored back to yourself from the universe for like long enough, um that you stop like certain projections, for example. This I talk a lot about this stuff in my most recent video, but if you get to that state, then things become less confined by like karma, and it's more like pure play, right? Just interacting with the universe. Not like pure play, but just more less blockages.
Like a
And
Dakini dancing. That's how we would depict it in Buddhism. It's the female deity. She's dancing. She has one foot, depending on the iconography, right or left, is like we call it Lalita Sadhana or
yes,
Lalitasana. So
right.
anyway, right? So
Well,
the play posture, that's exactly how you would translate it, is the posture of play.
yeah, and in order to do that, you do have to know yourself. I am more in this belief that we are born with like a certain image in us and a certain way that we fit into the cosmos just naturally. And through understanding where we fit, um right, like we're each a slight differentiation off of whatever was before us. And so there's something like very unique in all of us that is just unique to us, that exists in nothing else. Um, and so I just think that it's really important for us to know ourselves, and then from knowing ourselves is where the self authorship can really come out. And because then once you know yourself and you're not projecting like your shadow stuff, and the universe isn't trying to get you to know yourself, because I think that's what it does, right? It's constantly trying to mirror you to yourself, and it can do that through like dramatic karmic lessons, or um you resonating with something and then recognizing it in yourself, or you seeing your opposite and being like, ah, I know myself because I know that I am not that thing.